On June 19, 2026, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, published an article warning that a direct clash between NATO and Russia could rapidly turn into an exchange of nuclear strikes, with what he called catastrophic consequences. It was not a new sentence. Some version of it has been said, in public, by a senior Russian official on a rolling basis for more than 4 years. Here's what happened in the same window of time the warning was published. Ukrainian drones hit Moscow's largest oil refinery twice in 3 days, shutting it down until 2027. Days later, Russian air defenses reported intercepting 660 drones across a dozen Russian regions in a single night, a new record. Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014 and defended ever since as inviolably Russian soil, was under a tightening blockade, its residents rationing gasoline and its bridge to the mainland repeatedly struck. None of this triggered the retaliation the warnings describe. Researchers who try to count Russia's declared red lines arrive at different totals depending on their method. One widely cited tracker logged 24 distinct red line statements in 2022 alone and 15 more in 2023, and the pace has continued since, if unevenly. The exact tally is less important than the pattern underneath it. A nuclear power has spent 4 years drawing lines in public, watching them get crossed, and responding with something other than the catastrophe it promised. This isn't a story about whether Vladimir Putin will eventually use a nuclear weapon. Nobody can answer that with confidence, and this isn't a prediction. It's a story about what happens to deterrence itself when a threat gets made, tested, and not enforced. Over and over, in full view of the entire world. Start with the plain chronology, because the pattern only becomes visible once you see it laid end to end. In the war's earliest weeks, Putin declared merely supplying weapons to Ukraine a provocation with unspecified consequences. Western states sent helmets and anti-tank missiles first, then artillery, then HIMARS rocket systems in June 2022. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu warned that Western strikes on Russian territory using such systems would trigger retaliation against what he called Ukraine's decision-making centers. Ukraine has struck Russian territory with a widening range of weapons ever since. In late 2022, Putin declared that the city of Kherson had joined Russia forever. Ukraine liberated it within weeks. Rather than escalating, Russian forces withdrew across the Dnipro River. Around the same time, Ukraine began sinking or disabling Russian warships in the Black Sea in such numbers that by 2023, roughly a third of the fleet had been damaged or destroyed. The survivors quietly relocated from Crimea to the Russian port of Novorossiysk. In August 2024, Ukraine invaded Russia itself, seizing over 1,000 square kilometers of the Kursk region, described by more than one analyst at the time as the reddest red line Russia had. Putin downplayed the incursion as a provocation rather than responding as promised. Weeks later, on September 1st, Russia's deputy foreign minister confirmed the Kremlin was drafting a revised nuclear doctrine, an acknowledgement, in effect, that its old threats had stopped landing and needed a rewrite. That rewrite arrived on November 19th, 2024, and its timing was not a coincidence. Within hours of the Biden administration authorizing Ukraine to fire American-made ATACMS missiles into Russian territory, a step Putin had for years described as a move that would put NATO directly at war with Russia. Ukraine did exactly that, striking a military facility in Bryansk. The next day, Russia fired an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile, the Oreshnik, at a factory in Dnipro, the first combat use of a weapon of a type normally associated with nuclear payloads, though this one was conventionally armed. It was a dramatic, telegraphed gesture, and also, notably, not the nuclear response the old red line had implied. In June 2025, Ukrainian intelligence services executed Operation Spiderweb, smuggling drones deep into Russian territory in modified shipping containers and using them to strike multiple air bases hosting Russia's strategic bomber fleet, aircraft that form part of Russia's nuclear triad. By the letter of Russia's own 2020 doctrine, an attack that disrupts the response actions of nuclear forces is one of the explicit conditions under which nuclear weapons may be used. No such response followed. Ukraine's first F-16 fighters began flying combat missions from Ukrainian soil in August 2024. years after Moscow had described their delivery as a move that would put Ukraine's air force in direct confrontation with Russian nuclear-capable assets. Long-range Storm Shadow and ATACMS strikes deep inside Russia, once treated as unthinkable escalations that might draw a NATO-wide response, became close to routine through 2025, hitting targets as far from the front as the Voronezh region. Throughout the same stretch, fighting repeatedly flared around the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The kind of incident that, in any other context, would itself be treated as crossing every red line simultaneously, given the risk of a radiological accident on the scale of Chernobyl. It has not produced a nuclear response either, only recurring emergency shutdowns and international alarm from the UN's nuclear watchdog. By 2026, the list had grown almost too long to itemize individually. Ukrainian naval drones effectively closing the Kerch Strait to unescorted traffic, the drone blockade of Crimea tightening month over month, with the peninsula's Moscow-installed governor declaring a state of emergency in June over power and fuel shortages. And, running through the same weeks, the largest single drone assault on Moscow of the entire war, twice striking the capital's biggest oil refinery, followed 8 days later by a record 660 drones intercepted across a dozen regions in a single night. Lavrov's June 19th warning about nuclear exchange was published into exactly this environment. Not before the lines were crossed, but well after most of them already had been, repeatedly. To understand why this pattern matters, it helps to understand what a red line is supposed to accomplish in the first place. The classic formulation comes from the economist and strategist Thomas Schelling, who studied nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. A red line works by converting a vague preference into a specific, publicly stated commitment, so that the threatened party has no ambiguity left, and the party issuing the threat has staked its credibility on following through. The whole mechanism depends on cost. If crossing the line costs the target something real, and abstaining from retaliation costs the threatener something real, reputation, credibility, the ability to make the next threat land, then the line holds, because both sides have skin in the game. Applied to nuclear weapons specifically, a credible red line is meant to function as what one nuclear-era scholar called a point of no return, a threshold so serious that crossing it converts a conventional conflict into an existential one. That is an enormously high bar by design, because nuclear retaliation is supposed to be reserved for the gravest possible threats, and because a threat that gets invoked too casually, over stakes that plainly do not warrant it, starts to look less like resolve and more like noise. This is precisely the trap Russia has walked into. By declaring dozens of distinct actions, a weapons shipment, a fighter jet, a raid, a drone strike, as red lines carrying nuclear implications, Moscow set an enormous number of tripwires. Each one crossed without consequence didn't just fail to deter that specific action. It retroactively cheapened every other line still standing, because it taught observers that Kremlin's declared thresholds and its actual thresholds are two different things. There are several credible explanations for the gap between rhetoric and action, and honest analysis has to hold more than one of them at once, because they aren't mutually exclusive. The first is that ambiguity is the strategy, not a failure of it. Some scholars of Russian military doctrine argue that Moscow deliberately keeps its thresholds vague, and its responses calibrated below the threat level, preferring what one analysis calls a dosed approach, absorbing individual provocations while preserving the general atmosphere of risk, rather than committing to nuclear use over any single event. On this view, Russia isn't failing to enforce its red lines. It never intended most of them as literal commitments. They were cost-free rhetorical tools aimed at slowing Western decision-making, and by that narrower measure they worked for a while. Aid packages were delayed, permissions were hedged, allies argued among themselves about how far to go, precisely because nobody wanted to be the government that triggered World War III. The second explanation is closer to genuine restraint. Russia's actual, narrower doctrine, as opposed to its public rhetoric, has always reserved nuclear use for a much smaller set of conditions, a nuclear or WMD attack on Russia, or a conventional attack severe enough to threaten the state's existence. None of Kursk, Crimea, or the drone strikes on Moscow plausibly clear that bar, whatever officials say for effect. Under this reading, red lines haven't been crossed, so much as they were never real lines to begin with. They were domestic and international messaging, aimed at multiple audiences at once, that Western commentary mistook for binding commitments. The third is more mundane. Russia may simply lack a proportionate response that doesn't carry unacceptable costs of its own. A large-scale nuclear strike over, say, a drone attack on a refinery would isolate Russia even from sympathetic powers. Multiple analysts have noted that Beijing, New Delhi, and other governments Moscow depends on diplomatically have made clear, publicly and privately, that nuclear use in Ukraine would be a bridge too far. A strike serious enough to satisfy the rhetoric would very likely provoke exactly the kind of overwhelming Western response the threats were meant to prevent in the first place. In other words, the threat may be sincere in principle, but practically unusable in the specific, narrow circumstances where it keeps being invoked. None of these explanations requires Russian officials to be lying every time they invoke a red line, and none of them requires Ukraine and its partners to have been reckless in testing them. They can all be true simultaneously. A mix of strategic bluff, genuine but narrower doctrine, and simple unusability. And the result, regardless of which explanation carries the most weight in any given case, has been the same. The lines got crossed, and the promised consequence didn't arrive. Russia's own strategic community noticed the credibility problem well before Lavrov's June 2026 letter, and one debate in particular reveals how seriously it was taken inside Moscow. In June 2023, Sergei Karaganov, a veteran foreign policy advisor with decades of standing in Russian elite circles, published an essay arguing that Russia's nuclear deterrent had become worthless precisely because it was never used, and that the only way to restore it was deliberate escalation. A limited, preemptive nuclear strike against a NATO country supporting Ukraine, aimed not at cities but at military infrastructure, intended to reintroduce what he called the fear of nuclear hell into Western decision-making. His argument was explicit about the mechanism this documentary is describing. A threat that is never carried out stops being a threat, and the only way back to credibility is to demonstrate that the threshold is real by crossing it once, under controlled conditions. The essay provoked a genuine internal debate, not a unanimous one. Prominent Russian foreign policy figures publicly rejected the proposal in essays with titles like, "A preemptive nuclear strike? No!" arguing it would cost Russia its remaining international legitimacy for no proportionate gain. Putin himself, asked about it directly, said Russia saw no need to use nuclear weapons and that even discussing the possibility casually lowered the threshold in a way that wasn't in Russia's interest. Karaganov later claimed, in an interview conducted in the framework of ongoing Russian nuclear signaling rather than as a verified fact, that a large majority of Russia's military and political elite had come to share his view privately, whatever the public position. Whatever the true internal balance of opinion, the doctrine that emerged in November 2024 reads like a compromise between the rhetorical camp and the restraint camp. Not Karaganov's preemptive strike, but a formally lowered threshold on paper, expanding the conditions for nuclear use from a threat to the state's very existence to the broader standard of a critical threat to sovereignty or territorial integrity. Language broad enough, on its face, to cover a great deal more than the original doctrine did. If the point of the November 2024 revision was to restore the credibility of Russia's red lines, the 18 months since haven't cooperated. Ukraine's Kursk incursion continued for months afterward. The Crimea blockade intensified through the first half of 2026. The Moscow refinery was struck twice in the same week in June 2026, a few days before Lavrov's letter went out, and the letter itself carried no more specific a threshold than the rhetoric it replaced. A direct confrontation between NATO and Russia remains just as undefined a trigger as an existential threat to the state ever was. One assessment from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put the underlying problem plainly. The lower the declared threshold falls, the harder it becomes to believe any threshold exists at all, because the gap between what the doctrine now technically permits and what Russia has actually tolerated on the ground keeps widening rather than narrowing. This is the central irony of the past 18 months. Moscow rewrote its own rulebook specifically to reclaim deterrent credibility, and the rewrite has been followed by a bigger set of crossings, deeper strikes, closer to Moscow, against harder targets than came before it. Whatever the doctrine says on paper, the behavior it's supposed to deter keeps happening anyway, in full public view, without the consequence the paper promises. The pattern of the response has also stayed remarkably consistent, signaling instead of striking. In May 2026, days after a Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow, Russia abruptly announced and then carried out a large exercise of its full nuclear triad, tens of thousands of troops, submarines, strategic bombers, and land-based missile units, deliberately drawing on every leg of the arsenal at once. German and other NATO analysts who track this behavior describe it as a recognizable genre, a dramatic, well-publicized demonstration of capability, timed to follow a specific provocation that communicates resolve without actually crossing into use. It is a real signal, in the sense that it costs money and effort and draws attention. It is not the retaliation the original red line promised. It's tempting to treat this as simply good news, proof that nuclear blackmail doesn't work and that calling a bluff is generally safe. That reading misses the more uncomfortable second-order effect. A deterrent that nobody believes doesn't just fail quietly. It changes the incentives of the state that owns it. If Karagonov's argument reflects even a minority view inside Moscow's political military elite, and multiple Russian and Western analysts believe it reflects a great deal more than a minority, then the logical response to a credibility collapse isn't permanent restraint. It's the search for a low-cost way to demonstrate, once, that the threshold is real, precisely so the deterrent regains value for every future crisis. That is a genuinely different risk than the one most Western commentary focuses on, which treats each individual crossing as evidence the danger is overstated. The danger compounds specifically because each crossing is safely absorbed, until, on this logic, one isn't. There's a wider audience for this lesson than Russia and Ukraine, other states weighing their own nuclear or near-nuclear postures. North Korea, Iran during its own periods of confrontation with the West, and observers in Beijing thinking about Taiwan, are watching the same pattern play out and drawing their own conclusions about how much daylight typically exists between a great power's declared red lines and its willingness to enforce them. A deterrence failure in one theater doesn't stay contained to that theater. It becomes a data point in everyone else's calculation of how seriously to take the next country's threats, including their own. A state contemplating its own coercive nuclear signaling in a future crisis now has a recent, extensively documented case study suggesting that loud rhetoric, decoupled from a credible willingness to act, buys real strategic effect for a while, and that the strategic effect decays roughly in proportion to how many times the bluff gets called. There's a domestic Russian dimension to this as well, one that outside observers tend to underweight. A government that spends 4 years publicly promising catastrophic retaliation and then repeatedly declines to deliver it is not just managing an external audience. It is also managing its own population and its own military-political elite, some meaningful share of whom, by Karagonov's own account, have grown impatient with restraint they see as weakness rather than prudence. That internal audience doesn't necessarily share the outside world's read on why Russia has held back, and a leadership that needs to satisfy both audiences at once. A Western adversary it wants to intimidate and a domestic hardliner faction it needs to placate faces a genuinely harder problem than either audience alone would present. There are more immediate costs, too. Years of Western caution, delayed weapons deliveries, restrictions on how supplied weapons could be used, hedged public statements, were shaped directly by the fear that this specific red line or that one might be the one that mattered. Stephen Pfeiffer of the Brookings Institution has argued that Russia's inconsistent, contradictory signaling did real damage to its own interests as well. A Kremlin that might genuinely need a credible nuclear signal in some future crisis has spent its credibility on this one, and may find the well dry exactly when it needs it most. It would be a mistake to conclude from all this that Russian nuclear threats are pure theater with zero binding force, and the strongest version of the opposing argument deserves a full hearing. Proponents of this view point out that the lines Russia has consistently not allowed to be crossed are a different, narrower set than the ones getting all the attention. No NATO member state has been struck, no chemical or biological weapon has been used, and no tactical nuclear weapon has been employed, even after 4+ years of exactly the kind of provocation that, on paper, might justify it. Seen this way, Russia's restraint isn't collapsing. It's holding exactly where the real doctrine, as opposed to the rhetorical one, always said it would. The refineries, the bridges, the bomber bases were never truly existential to the Russian state, whatever officials said in the moment for effect, and treating loud rhetoric as equivalent to a real threshold was always a category error made mostly by outside observers, not evidence of a broken deterrent. There's also a case that ambiguity, even after being tested dozens of times, still retains value precisely because no single crossing has definitively proven where the actual line sits. Strategic ambiguity is, by design, resistant to falsification. Every crossing that doesn't trigger a response can be explained afterward as having fallen short of the real threshold, which means the deterrent can survive an enormous number of tests without technically being disproven, right up until the one time it isn't. None of this resolves into a clean forecast, and any documentary that claims otherwise is overselling its own analysis. What the last 4 years actually show is a mechanism, not a verdict. A nuclear power drew an unusually large number of public red lines, absorbed the crossing of nearly all of them without the promised response, attempted to restore credibility by formally lowering its own threshold, and watched the crossings continue anyway. Multiple explanations for that gap are simultaneously plausible. Calculated bluff, genuine but narrower restraint, and simple unusability of the threatened response. And outside observers have no reliable way to know, crossing by crossing, which explanation is operating in any given instance. That uncertainty is exactly the uncomfortable part. A credible deterrent is supposed to make everyone's calculations easier, because everyone knows where the line is and what happens if it's crossed. What the last 4 years have produced instead is a deterrent whose real threshold nobody outside the Kremlin can identify with confidence, including, quite possibly, people inside the Kremlin who disagree with each other about where it sits. Ambiguity that never gets resolved can look, for a long time, exactly like weakness. The two states are genuinely difficult to distinguish from the outside, and the search for a way to prove the difference, for anyone motivated to try, is precisely what makes an already dangerous situation harder to read, not easier.